bread, rice, potatoes. These are the foods that people with diabetes are often told to avoid. But these foods are major staples in most people's cuisines. So good luck with that, because it's not realistic to cut those things out long term. But the truth is, you can eat them safely if you know how. I'm Dr. SYNAPSE, and I want to show you how to enjoy eating carbohydrates without sending your blood sugar on a roller coaster. I want to cover practical and science-based strategies that you can start today to flatten those glucose spikes after meals and, in the process, improve your insulin resistance. And a quick note, even though I'm a physician, I'm not your physician. So please talk to your doctor before you make any changes to your diet or your medical regimen. So let's start with one of the most powerful but probably least known tools that we have for this, and that is resistant starch. Most starches, things like bread and pasta, foods made out of flour, break down into glucose, and this is what raises your blood sugar pretty quickly. Those repeated blood sugar spikes drive worsening insulin resistance and lead to pancreas dysfunction, which ultimately is what makes your diabetes worse. But resistant starch digests and behaves very differently. Your enzymes are just not good at digesting resistant starch. So instead of being broken down quickly and spiking your blood glucose, resistant starch travels to the large intestine, where your gut bacteria ferment it. That fermentation produces short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, which actually improve your insulin sensitivity, help reduce inflammation, and even feed the lining of your colon cells. So how do you get resistant starch? Well, one good trick is you can take your typical starchy foods that would normally raise your blood sugar, and you cool them, and then heat them back up before you eat them. By doing that, you increase the food's resistant starch content. You can take bread, pasta, and rice, and when you cool them, part of the starch crystallizes into this resistant form. It's a process called starch retrogradation, where gelatinized starch molecules like amylose realign and form crystalline structures that basically resist digestion in your small intestine. So you can still eat your favorite foods, just cool them and heat them up later, and enjoy the metabolic benefits. There are multiple studies showing that cooling cooked rice or potatoes down to about 39 degrees Fahrenheit, around 4 degrees Celsius, for 24 hours significantly increases resistant starch content compared to freshly cooked starches. And clinically, eating cooled and then reheated rice or potatoes does lead to reduced postprandial glucose and reduced insulin spikes. So if you're eating at home, you do not have to give up bread or rice or potatoes. Just cool or freeze them first and then reheat. It may not taste exactly the same, but it's going to be pretty close, and the benefits are very hard to ignore. Plus, there are many other foods that are naturally high in resistant starch that you can add to your regimen. Things like beans, lentils, peas, and whole grains like oats and barley. Okay. The next principle is food pairing. With carbs, we rarely eat them in isolation, and what you eat alongside your carbs can dramatically change the glucose response. There are studies, like this meta-analysis of 154 trials, showing that just adding protein to a carbohydrate meal can reduce the glucose area under the curve by up to 50% in healthy adults. We also have evidence that fat can blunt early glucose spikes because fat helps delay gastric emptying and can help with insulin clearance. And all of this eventually improves your beta cell function in the pancreas. That's why, ideally, we do not want to eat starchy or processed carbohydrates in isolation. Some people call this avoiding naked carbs. That's why rice and beans is usually better than just rice alone. Or potatoes with butter, or potatoes with olive oil, tend to produce a gentler glucose spike compared to eating potatoes alone. Another thing we can do is add acid to our meals, things like vinegar, lemon, or lime. Many fermented foods can help with that. They lower the rate at which starch is broken down. Vinegar can also help with insulin sensitivity in your muscles, and it can blunt glucose spikes on its own by working on liver gluconeogenesis. I actually made a separate video on all the benefits of apple cider vinegar and how to use it, and I'll post a link to that in the description below. And by the way, another way you can supercharge your food pairing is by eating your carbohydrates last, because food order actually matters here. If you start your meal with bread or juice, you get a sharp glucose peak. But if you eat your protein and your vegetables first and then finish with carbs, the stomach releases a slower mix of glucose into the intestines, and you end up absorbing that glucose much more slowly. The beauty is, it's the exact same food, but if you eat it in a different order, you get a completely different glucose curve. This is especially important in restaurants, where they like to give you bread or nachos before bringing out your salad or your main entree. So eat your salad and your protein first, and then go for the bread or the nachos. It's a very small behavioral change, but it pays off huge metabolic dividends. There are multiple clinical studies that show exactly that, like a randomized controlled crossover trial showing that people with type 2 diabetes who ate their protein and vegetables before their carbohydrates had a 40% lower glucose area under the curve and 31% lower insulin area under the curve. And then there was a recent study in Japan that used continuous glucose monitors in healthy Japanese adults. That study showed that eating rice last significantly reduced postprandial glycemic excursions. Now, another thing that can make a big difference is walking right after a meal. We have studies, like a randomized controlled trial, showing that just a 10-minute walk immediately after a meal can lower your postprandial glucose. It doesn't have to be walking. Any kind of light activity, like cleaning up in the kitchen or climbing stairs, can make a difference. But walking has been the most studied and is probably the easiest for most people to do. You just have to remember that the best time to walk or exercise would be as soon as possible after a meal. The reason walking after eating is so powerful is because walking activates your soleus muscles. The soleus is that muscle in your calf that runs just below the knee to the heel. The soleus muscle is a metabolic powerhouse because it can soak up a lot of glucose very quickly. Another thing that makes this muscle so special is that it's composed of slow twitch fibers, which allow it to sustain contractions for long periods of time without fatiguing. So you're burning lots of glucose for a long period before your muscle gets tired. Next, a lot of people will tell you, just cut out all carbs, and this will help you reverse your diabetes and fix your insulin resistance. But it's really not the carbs per se. It's the type of carbs that cause problems with insulin resistance and diabetes, because not all carbs are created equal. The way these carbs are processed determines how fast they're absorbed and how quickly they hit your bloodstream. Flour milled into a fine powder, like white bread or instant oats, digests extremely quickly. But whole grains or coarser grains digest much slower, and they just don't cause the same issues as processed carbohydrates. Think of it like kindling versus logs in a fire. Fine flour, which is what you see in white bread, cereal, pastries, chips, is like throwing sawdust into the fire. It burns fast and it burns hot. On the flip side, you have steel-cut oats, intact grains, and high-fiber carbohydrates. They burn more like logs, slower and more evenly. For your body, that just means smaller and steadier glucose curves, instead of sharp spikes and crashes. So just like with resistant starches, choose carbohydrates made from whole foods, minimally processed and high in fiber. Fiber is probably the most important carbohydrate that you do not want to miss if you choose to do a low-carb diet. Because for most people, the benefits of extra fiber are huge and just too hard to ignore. And one last tip, do not eat late at night. The later you eat, the worse your glucose response. We have numerous studies showing that eating close to bedtime worsens your ability to process glucose, even if you don't eat a carb-heavy meal. That's because physiologically, our insulin sensitivity and our pancreas's ability to secrete insulin all follow a circadian rhythm. where we just can't process glucose as well in the evening as we do earlier in the day. What makes this worse is that late at night is when we get elevated levels of endogenous melatonin, which actually further reduces insulin secretion. Less insulin means more glucose in our bloodstream. So the earlier you eat your dinner, the better. I would recommend eating your last meal of the day, ideally at least 3 hours before bedtime. Alright, I hope this is helpful. If you want to keep eating bread, rice, and potatoes without wrecking your blood sugar, don't just scroll away. Hit like so this reaches more people with diabetes or insulin resistance. And subscribe to Dr. Synapse for more science-based strategies to master your metabolism and protect your long-term health. Comment "Carbs Smarter" if you're going to try at least one of these tips at your next meal. And share this video with someone who thinks they have to give up carbs forever. They might just need a better strategy, not a stricter diet.